Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Phase 2 webinar, Cutting Through the Noise, Writing On-Brand, Effective, and Accessible Content. My name is Chris Jorgensen, and I'm excited to turn things over to today's presenter, Cara Lemieux, in just a few moments to get us started. If you're like many organizations, your brand guidelines focus heavily on your visual brand language, but voice guidelines are equally important in creating a consistent and distinct on-brand experience, reinforcing your values, mission, or purpose. In this webinar, we're going to outline how to ensure the content you're writing is positioned for maximum impact on your audience and teach you how to shift your focus from what you want to say to what your audience needs. For those of you who might not know us, Phase 2 is a digital experience agency moving industry-leading organizations forward with powerful ideas and executable strategies built on open technology. Founded in 2001 and headquartered in Arlington, Virginia, we have offices located in New York City, Portland, and San Francisco. Experts in the complete digital experience, our team provides services including research and insights, strategy and design, and engineering expertise for building digital platforms. Through the services offered, Phase 2 enables engagement with target audiences in any channel on any device. Today's presenter is Cara Lemieux. Cara is Phase 2's Director, Communications and Content. She's an Emmy Award-winning former network news producer and uses a journalistic approach to tell stories that break through the noise and connect with humans. Effective communication and engaging storytelling are part of her soul. Cara's experience in the field of communications is diverse and includes broadcast, digital, and B2B with industry expertise in the nonprofit, tech, parenting, and women's spaces. She's also a TEDx speaker and has spoken about rebranding the single mom. The practice area and team she oversees at Phase 2 follows content from creative conception to publishing and focuses on 3 areas of specialty: front-end content strategy, back-end content strategy, and copywriting. Cara, take it away.
Hello, everybody. I wanted to take a moment to thank you all for joining us. I know you all are very busy when there's not a major global crisis among us, and I'm sure you all have a million other things on your plates. So I really wanted to just take a quick moment and thank you all for putting aside the time to join us. I'm really excited to talk about cutting through the noise and really encompass topics related to who's your audience, brand voice and tone, plain language best practices, writing for accessibility, and then take some time for your questions. So I'm going to outline how to ensure the content you're writing is positioned for maximum impact on your audience. And like Chris said, teach you how to shift your focus from what you want to say to really what your audience needs. I'm incredibly passionate about the audience, and on client projects, I often see myself as an audience advocate because it's really easy to lose focus on that audience once tough decisions need to be made and frankly, egos get involved. So in order to create that content for your audience, excuse me, and create a consistent conversation with them, we're going to focus on the 4 areas that I mentioned. And just one quick note about writing for accessibility. That is a very deep topic, and we will touch on a few key areas that we think are really valuable for you to focus on. But we also hope to have a follow-up webinar with our internal accessibility expert, Catherine McNally, in the coming months. So with that, my goal for today, just to be really clear, is to better enable you to write effective, accessible, on-brand content for your digital channel. Before we go any further, we need to talk about this audience that I just mentioned. And we need to stay keenly focused on them throughout this talk. And really, as content creators and as writers, through every piece of work we do, we need to repeatedly bring that focus back to the audience. They are the most important people in this entire content and communications equation. The best work I've ever seen makes me, a member of a specific audience, say, oh, they get me. They so get me. The types of ads that come to mind are Procter & Gamble's Thank You Mom ads from a while ago, this Instagram ad that I was served up last spring, and the website content that followed for a new eco-friendly lawn care company called Sunday, and all of the content that I read on, SoFi, the fintech lender's website. They have really achieved this ooh, they get me feeling. And the only way to do that is by putting the audience's needs front and center. So how do you do that? Well, your audience is really typically comprised of a number of smaller audiences. I'm sure all of you on this call know that. But it's really important to note that they each have different needs and goals. Then they are also similar in important ways. And we're not going to go into detail about all of the different ways that you can sort of get in your audience's heads and define them today. But there are some key tools that we use here at Phase 2 for documenting your audience. And our user experience and research team really gives us this great starting point to then develop content for. And, those include market segmentation, empathy mapping, and developing empathy is really key in creating the content and the digital experience that audience needs. It's important, if possible, to put faces to names, to move out of that hypothetical and to talk to real members of your audience or to hear from real members of your audience. This can be done in interviews or reading customer service reports, even researching, keywords, seeing the words people use around search terms, gives you a sense and insight into the language they use, or even reading about what people say on you on social media, say about your organization, your brand. You can also spend a day in the shoes of your audience, ethnographic observations we found to be really useful. And ideally, what you're trying to achieve is to be able to picture the person that you're writing to. This is actually a great tip in Ann Handley's book, Everybody Writes. It's to really, really picture someone you're writing to, especially if you're stuck when you're writing. But the bottom line is, if you can't clearly articulate who your audience is for a piece of content you're creating, the success of that content is compromised. Why is this? Well, let's take a look at a healthcare system site, for example. Physicians have very different needs and perspectives than their patients do, and those patients very likely have different needs and perspectives than caregivers do. Another example on a government site, for example, tax professionals have different needs than regular taxpayers. So understanding those really helps you develop content that's effective and really, really gets through to their needs. So how do you need to show up to your audience to break through and establish that credibility? It's very important to develop your brand voice. It's a key component of this. It's the filter through which you run your content and all of your communication through so that you create that consistent experience and an emotional connection with your audience. Many times brand guidelines, as Chris mentioned earlier, and I think as we mentioned in our invite, I find that they focus really heavily on design guidelines. And that's great. That's incredibly important. But voice guidelines are really important in guiding your communication in the right direction and reinforcing an organization's mission and brand. So let's dig in and discuss how we create these and the how and what, and we're in the how of what we are communicating. So before we go any further, let's level set on how we are defining brand voice. I don't know about you, but terms like brand and content strategy can be all encompassing and therefore meaningless at the same time. So I find it's really helpful to simply define them. In a blog post by writer and digital marketing expert Ann Handley, I've already mentioned, this is my second mention of her. Clearly, I really love her thought leadership. She defines brand voice simply as how the writing or copy sounds in a reader's head. And I love this definition because it focuses, yet again, on the audience and the kind of experience, in this case, the voice, that we're working to create in their head. There are so many different ways to say the same thing, and that's why it's important to have a voice really guiding that communication so it's said in a consistent way. And your brand voice communicates so much, just like your own voice. It signals your personality. It can signal your values. For example, do you value authenticity over professionalism? It can even indicate your mission or purpose. And it really shows that you have empathy for your audience, or it will show if you have empathy for your audience. And there's another reason that we really feel brand voice is incredibly important, and that's because it creates consistency, and consistency creates trust and removes friction in your brain. So people aren't trying to figure out why something sort of sounds one way in one area of the site and sounds another way in another area of the site. Just makes it simpler. So think about someone you regularly text with. Maybe it's your best friend. Maybe it's your sister, your spouse. When you text with them, there are certain quirks and habits that make their writing unique and totally them. You probably have friends that use all caps in these text messages, or love overusing emojis, or someone like me that frequently uses ellipses for the dramatic pause. Or you may have somebody that often uses colorful language. Now let's think about the person that uses colorful language. If they all of a sudden started writing texts that said things like, oh golly gee, the darndest thing happened to me today, you would probably pause and wonder, or even worry that something wasn't right. That's because dramatic changes in someone's language, voice, or tone can trigger uncomfortable feelings, including distrust. So the goal is that at every point of your digital experience or your website, you create this experience that your audience feels like they're having a conversation with the same person. So if all of this is brand voice, then what is tone? And tone is really how you slightly modify that voice to be appropriate for the audience that you're speaking to. So, for example, when you talk to your kids versus when you speak to your boss, and some of us are probably doing those two things in like the same 5 minute span right now, tone can and should change depending on who that audience is in the situation, the medium and channel. But that voice really remains constant. So now that you've established what it is, how do you create brand voice? We don't just pull a brand voice out of nowhere. A brand voice is informed by your brand guidelines. And in some cases, they are part of brand guidelines. But when they aren't, they should be informed by the other brand assets. So, when we show up on client projects, brand guidelines can look quite different. And if they don't have a brand voice already clearly articulated or one that's really applied, we look to either update it or create it. Typically, when looking at an organization's existing brand guidelines, I find it's really helpful to look at either brand personality or something like core values. I find that they translate and they inform brand voice really well. And it's important to note here, like this is more of an art than a science. Certain words have certain connotations and meanings inside of an organization. So this does take some work and adapting based on where an organization's brand is. But let's take a little example that we have up here. So if we have a core value, a brand has a core value of compassion. We sort of look at it and say, okay, if we embody compassion, then we are empathetic and welcoming. And you look at those two descriptors as ways to define that brand voice. And then the next layer of that is to really put up some guardrails and put up some qualifiers. So empathetic yet strong. This really helps just give more specific guidance to whoever is applying this brand voice. Another note here is that we really like to have no more than 5 qualifiers. If it becomes more than that, it becomes too complex. It's really hard for people to remember. And then there's oftentimes a lot of sort of synonyms and duplication. And I also want to really call attention here to the fact that your brand foundation and the guidelines that come from it are really only valuable in application. If these elements sit on a drive somewhere or printed out and put on a shelf, they're essentially meaningless. What the audience sees is how these guidelines are applied through the design elements on your site, your logo, your messaging, your voice, how you frame your story. And the difference between applying the brand guidelines and creating them, everybody needs to be brought in. Content creators need to nurture that voice. So we found it's really helpful, and we've seen great success with holding a writing workshop with your team, where you take content contributors and you take your existing content and you really rewrite it with a very strong brand voice, and applying the plain language and accessibility best practices that we're going to get to in a little bit. So plain language, we've talked about your brand. Now let's talk about how to take that brand voice and use it to write for your site. For those of you unfamiliar with what plain language is, the Plain Language Action and Information Network, PLANE, is a group of federal employees from different agencies and specialties who support the use of clear communication in government writing. Originally called the Plain English Network, Plain has been meeting informally since the 90s, and their goal is to promote the use of plain language for all government communications. They believe that this will save time and money. These guidelines and recommendations aren't only valuable to government agencies. There are practices that are really valuable to all digital content, and that's because they focus on making things easier on the user and easier on your audience. Plain language and readability is in no way linked to the education level of your audience. It's not dumbing it down or insulting highly educated users. Instead, it's about getting the message across while asking sort of the smallest cognitive load on your users to get it. The fact that a user reads and writes research journals all day or something like that does not change how much effort he or she's willing to expend understanding your message as they scroll past it on their phone. And it's the next filter in which you run your content through. The first is brand voice, as we mentioned, and the second is really plain language. So before we get into the specifics of plain language best practices, I want to share a quote from our head of user experience, Rebecca Fanning. She really is focused on making sure that we understand that writing for the web requires an understanding of how visitors interact with it, how people are behaving on our sites. So in Steve Krug's book, Don't Make Me Think, he really uses the analogy that users are sharks and they're inclined to keep moving. So if they don't find what they're looking for easily, they move along. They got to keep moving forward or they'll die. And much of the user's motivation is to save time. Think about yourself. You don't want to spend any more time than you need to trying to complete a task. What a user, and it's important to note we are all users, first land on a page. We don't read, we scan. Just like the shark, scanning the environment, quickly evaluating which is best for them. Human users quickly evaluate for things like, does this page look like it can meet my need? Does this source look trustworthy? These are subconscious split-second decisions. Then and only then will we read the content. And once we find something that works, we tend not to look for a better way. We really are creatures of habit and like to stick with what works. So Nielsen Norman Group ran this study back in 1997. And it's incredible because what they found still holds true today, but so many sites still fall down on these fairly simple tactics 23 years later. So in this study, they had some control copy that you see here on the right, and they ran tests and measured usability by recall and retention. When they got rid of half the words on the page, they increased usability by 27%. When they made it scannable, same text, new layout using bullet points, they increased usability by 47%. So my note here and sort of my general rule of thumb is if you have a list of more than 3 nouns, bullet them out. Using neutral language, they increased usability by 27%. And when they put it all together, concise, scannable, and objective, they increased usability by 124%. And it's really important to note here, this is not typically how we start our writing. This is where the editing comes in. And this is why it's so vital that we take the time to edit. It's when we take another pass through to make sure that the content we're creating doesn't only make sense to us, the writer, but is really easy to understand for, again, the audience. And when you write like this, you're communicating to your audience that you care about them and you value their time. And subconsciously, this also builds up their trust of your brand. Another important tactic is to use the inverted pyramid style of writing. This is really the same approach that journalists use. The most important information goes to the top. I find this is one of the most common edits I make to my own writing and anybody from my team's writing. And also, I teach a video production class at a local university here. And then it was the most common piece of feedback I gave to my students as well, which was like, take the sort of last 10 to 15 seconds of your video and move it up to the top. That's because we typically build up to the most important element when we're writing that first draft. That's how we were taught to write in English class. And what we're really asking content creators and writers to do is do the opposite of that. So it's just important to note that this is sort of a muscle that takes a little practice in order to become pretty strong at. And then there's another, 3 important ways to really write for that scanning user that are important. They are to use highlighted keywords, so hypertext links, typeface variations, colors. Make sure that you have meaningful subheadings. Again, think about people skimming through that content, and then usually stick to one idea per paragraph. Users will typically skip over any additional ideas if they're not caught by the first few words of a paragraph, and then sort of repeating what I shared a few moments ago, having that scannable text, bulleted and numbered lists, half the word count or less of conventional writing, and inverted pyramid style. It is an act of empathy writing like this and putting yourself in your audience's shoes. And it's important to note that shorter is often more difficult and takes a larger investment of time. But not everybody is a scanning user. Not everybody is actually reading or skimming the words on the screen, and not everyone may be consuming the content using 2 hands, whether that's because they're differently abled or because they have a baby in their hands. These things really don't matter. What matters is that we really think through the way to make the content accessible to our entire audience. So as I mentioned earlier, accessibility, even as it specifically relates to content, is a really deep topic. And we'll be having follow-up webinar with our Phase 2 accessibility expert, Catherine McManally, in the coming months. But we want to cover a few key things that we as content creators can and should keep in mind when writing. Providing accessible content also not only has the net effect of providing a better content experience for everyone, but it also can impact and improve your SEO. And reviewing for accessibility, you may have to rethink the image you've chosen. If you can't explain succinctly in alt text, it's probably not conveying a clear message to the sighted user either. So it really forces us to be very thoughtful about all of the details and the elements that go into our content creation. So much of this also impacts searchability and findability for all users. And it's the last filter your content sort of runs through before it hits that specific digital channel and then out to the audience. So a 2019 survey of homepages found that 97.8% had WCAG2 failures. 97.8%. And the most common failures, of the top 3, 2 of the most common failures and issues were related to content writing, missing alt text and empty links. These are things we can easily fix and remedy to just make our digital experience much more accessible and engaging for all of our users. So alt text, really think of it like a tweet. You want it to be short, lead with purpose, and consider intent and emotion. You want it to be really descriptive, and not to be something that sort of could be multiple, you know, use sort of a sentence that could describe a myriad of different imagery. So how would you describe this image for someone who cannot see it? Take a look. I'll give you a second to look at it. You know, a very simple, straightforward way, man does physical therapy. But if you take a look again and you really focus on being more descriptive and adding emotion and really describing to the person who is looking at the image, you know, what is on the screen, and creating a picture in someone's head, something like determined man working with a physical therapist to build his shoulder strength using an exercise band. Now you get a full picture of what's going on in that imagery. And it's incredibly important that we take the time and the effort needed to create alt text like this. The other top issue that survey found was with links. Meaningful, really the goal here is to make links meaningful on their own. This can take work. Again, these details are incredibly important to what we do and are often best accomplished not in that first draft of writing, but in the editing process. So here we've got two different sort of examples: unclear link text, you know, sort of click here, more info, read more. If someone was going through and just hearing those links out of context, they wouldn't have any idea what that information that is being linked to. Clearer link text is, you know, today's weather forecast, learn about phase 2 technology, Europe travel tips. And the reason for this is users who are blind or have low vision do not always receive context around a link. They need to understand the links on their own. Users of screen readers may use a shortcut to review all of the links on a page. If they say click here, it gets confusing on which is which. And this is the way of this is their way of scanning the page quickly. Speech to text assistive technology may not distinguish which click here the user announces either. So if they say, okay, go to click here, there's 4 or 5 of them, it could be unclear on which one they actually mean. Another few areas to be aware of and that can really help you create more accessible content is to have descriptive page titles. Page titles are the first element announced to the screen reading software. They really provide an accurate description for search results, and it's important to provide a descriptive name for tabs. Another element to be aware of is to keep headings in order. Otherwise, it confuses users of a screen reader. So those H1 through H6 aren't just stylistic elements. They're really a way to convey hierarchy and are incredibly valuable to people who may not be just reading the content on the screen. And it's really important to break up content with long chunks of content with visuals. This is really beyond accessibility. I think just stylistically, we've become so accustomed to seeing much smaller graphs of text accompanied by visual elements. And there's plenty of data out there about how visuals communicate things really effectively. They grab people's attention better than text only. So those things are really important to keep in mind as well. And just to bring it full circle, these are the key filters you'll want your information your organization is putting out to run through, to really break through that noise and meet the audience's needs and meet them where they're at. As you'll see on the left side, we recognize that you have a multitude of contributors in your organization contributing to that content. You have different people, different departments, different understanding of what the brand is. So that's why we think it's really important to be very intentional about defining all of these aspects so that that audience at the end can really have their needs met, and the content on your website doesn't feel like it is written by, 4 or 5 different people. And I think that pretty much covers it.
Thanks, Cara. At this time, we obviously want to answer any questions you might have, and feel free to send them our way using the Q&A panel in Zoom. Cara, I see we have a few already in the queue, so I'm going to jump right in and
Awesome.
throw them away. Our first question comes from Josh, and he asks, what's the biggest mistake you see enterprise organizations making today with their brand voice?
I think I see 2 mistakes. One is, especially with enterprise organizations, having a brand voice that organizations think it's differentiated, but really is very similar to every other brand voice out there. And then not providing sort of examples to content creators in exactly what it looks like in application. It's really incredibly important, I think, to say like, okay, here are the guidelines, but here's what they look like when you apply them. So that people can draw a clear picture, and really devoting some time to training people and getting them up to speed. And then the other mistake I see is not having one at all. Just having it sort of understood inside of the organization, and having brand guidelines that focus very heavily on design, but leave out the content and the messaging aspect of brand.
Awesome. Thanks, Cara. Our next question comes from Sarah, and she'd like to know, for teams with multiple content authors, how do you recommend incorporating the inverted pyramid writing strategy you talked about earlier?
So I think, again, this is one of those things that's going to take a little bit of practice, but I think it's really important to have an editor who is good at it, frankly, who it comes naturally to, or who has perfected it over a period of time, and have them sort of, copy edit the content and help train up the team and get them thinking like that. I find it's one of those things when I'm not writing in that style for a while, I get out of practice and I have to retrain myself. And I was a journalist for over 10 years. So if that happens to me, I'd say it's just really important to keep that in mind with your teams as well, that it's probably going to take some practice and some training.
Cara, our next question, I think you'll find very familiar, as you probably get this in your practice quite a bit. Anne asks, how do you see personalization coexisting with plain language best practices?
Interesting. So personalization is a really hot topic. I'm sure a number of you on this call have had conversations about it, or have read some thought leadership about it. I think that personalization, that plain language is actually everything that we discussed today, brand voice, plain language, accessibility, is the foundation upon which you build your personalization experience. So you really want to make sure that you're adhering to those practices for for plain language and accessibility, and that you have the consistent brand voice for any audience that you're personalizing content or an experience for.
Cara, our next question comes from Michael, and he asks, what's an empty link?
So an empty link is a link that just doesn't have anything that's valuable in the title. So it's something that just doesn't lead anywhere related to the actual sort of content that you're linking to.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Landon. He would like to know, Of the three core areas you touched on today, which one do you see organizations struggling with the most?
That's a really good question. I would say plain language. I find those are the biggest debates and the biggest areas of education that we sort of have to provide for our clients sometimes. I think fundamentally and sort of philosophically they're on board with plain language best practices, but when you start actually developing the content, there's this inclination to make it longer, put more information in there, and a little bit of a difficulty accepting really how that end user experiences the content.
Perfect. Going to give everybody a second just for any other questions.
I'm going to take a sip of water too.
Yeah. And when you have a chance, if you want to show them that reference slide you were alluding to earlier, which obviously we'll have as part of this recording, a lot of great content here that Cara referenced during the presentation today.
There we go.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of Cara and our team, thank you for joining us today. If you would like to reach out to Cara or have any questions you might want to ask us offline, please feel free to contact us anytime via email at marketing@phase2technology.com. We'll also be following up with a recording of today's webinar for easy sharing and on-demand access. And in the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.